Greetings. Welcome to a Clear Mountain interview. And today we're blessed to be joined by Oren Jay Sofer, author of Say What You Mean and most recently, Your Heart Was Made for This. Generally, we would read the bio of the guest, but actually today we thought, Oren, we would ask you to introduce yourself and tell us about your path in Buddhism briefly and sort of how you came to land here, and also your path through those two books. And can I also just say we're very grateful to have you join us. Your books have been hugely valuable to us and quite meaningful. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a real honor. I'm delighted to be here and touched that you reached out and invited me. We were just chatting before, and Ajahn Kovilo and I have known each other kind of loosely through the community for, I don't know, over a decade probably.
Yeah.
So quite sweet to reconnect and be here. Yeah, and also it's very meaningful for me to know that my writing or my work has contributed to you and to the monastic community. So thank you for sharing that. Well, I started practicing Dhamma when I was 19. I had the good fortune of doing a study abroad program in India, in Bodh Gaya, living at the Burmese Vihara in my undergraduate studies. And I kind of dove in headfirst and was very moved by the first teachers we had there at the program, who happened to be Anagarika Munindraji and Godwin Samaratne, a mindfulness teacher, a Dhamma teacher from Sri Lanka. So I started there and kind of radically changed my life. I was a childhood actor before that, and I changed my major at college and stopped acting, started meditating every day. And things just kind of unfolded from there. About 5 or 6 years later, when I was living at the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, the Insight Meditation Center founded by Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, Jack Kornfield, and Jacqueline Mandel, I was working there and living there as a cook, a residential retreat center cook. I discovered Marshall Rosenberg's work with nonviolent communication, which was another kind of like revelation. I felt another sense of homecoming with that practice, and it provided a very practical bridge to translate what I was cultivating on the cushion in my meditation into my conversations and relationships. How to embody the kind of compassion and clarity that we cultivate in meditation in communication. And then some years later, I came across Peter Levine's work with a practice known as somatic experiencing for healing trauma, which added yet another lens and toolkit to working with the body, with emotions, with deep-seated patterns in the nervous system that also I found to be very resonant and consistent with Dhamma practice. In fact, many of the principles that Peter Levine was talking about, I had heard my teachers talk about in Dhamma practice, both Ajahn Sucitto, Michelle McDonald. I think that they, in their own way, sort of drew from their own experiences with different kinds of trauma healing and somatic work, and were able to language Dharma teachings and meditation processes in that framework. So it all started to kind of fit together. And yeah, in 2018, I think, I published my first book, Say What You Mean, which is an integration of some of those different streams and really looking at how do we use mindfulness and nonviolent communication to improve our relationships and our conversations. And then my most recent book, Your Heart Was Made for This. There are two ways I talk about what inspired me to write the book. So from the perspective of communication, it provides a much broader training ground for all of the other qualities that are necessary to have important and difficult conversations, things like courage and curiosity and patience and equanimity and renunciation, letting go, all of these skills that we actually need to draw on when we're talking about things that are deeply meaningful and important to us in our lives. And so that's one angle on the book, is kind of filling in the rest of the background for having more effective conversations in our lives. The other background and sort of initial impetus of the book was the really difficult year we had in 2020, and wanting to contribute to more resilience in our communities, and really seeing the Buddha's teachings on right effort and cultivating wholesome qualities, releasing, abandoning unskillful qualities as a kind of roadmap for resilience. And so I started writing about different qualities from my own experience, from my training in Dhamma, both in lay communities and the monastic community, and trying to make it really practical for people. How do we cultivate more patience? How do we cultivate integrity or resolve or rest or ease? How do we actually make these experiences real in our life so that we are more resourced and well prepared to engage with the really overwhelming challenges that are unfolding around the planet?
Thank you. I'm interested in the fact that much of your work seems to be focused on this intersection between what are timeless teachings and the moment we live in, or the day-to-day actions we find ourselves in, such as communication or dealing with difficult times. And I know that you've spent a significant period in monasteries. I was wondering, now that you've also been a lay Buddhist teacher and moved in those circles as well, speaking to this intersection, which I think represents a really fascinating interplay, what do you feel is the most important lesson that the monastic communities and teachers could be sort of gleaning from many of the Dharma lay teachers? And what do you feel is an important lesson that the sort of Dharmic lay teachers might be gaining from the monastic ethos? And granted, these are huge, broad brushstrokes. You can't group everyone into categories, but I am curious that there are certain flavors or threads which are perhaps more pronounced in each realm. And I'm curious how you found those two merging or informing your own teaching and practice.
I mean, it's a humbling question in a lot of ways. The Buddha talked about the fourfold Sangha, right? And I really see the monastic and the lay communities supporting each other, and I think that they're set up to meet different needs. I have several friends, my own generation, who we used to hang out together here in San Francisco area as lay people who are both monastics in the Thai forest, the Ajahn Chah Western lineage. And our lives are quite different. And I think that the forms of our practice reflect that and reflect different priorities, and they're trying to meet different needs. I think like one of the things that I received from my time at the monasteries, I spent about a year just as a lay guest at Chithurst in England, and then 2.5 years in White as an anagarika, both at Chithurst and at Tisarana, Ajahn Viradama's place in Ontario, is the value of form in practice. And I think this is one of the things that, in particular, the lay insight meditation world underemphasizes because of the cultural context in the West and the psychological tendency towards striving and overachieving and rigidity. There's this kind of movement to counter it with a lot of emphasis on gentleness, relaxation, even a certain kind of formlessness. And I think that is only useful to a certain point. And there's a lot of resistance in the lay community to working with a form, whether it's anapanasati or sort of techniques of meditation, like the body scan or mental noting, all these different meditation exercises we have. Or the rigorousness of following a schedule or having a set commitment. And, as you know far better than I do, so much of monastic life is learning through the form, learning to discover our strengths, the nature of freedom and letting go, through pushing up against constraint and form. So this is, I think, something that we in the lay community can really take from and learn from the monastic world. Other aspects of my time in the monasteries that hold a lot of value that I think the lay community doesn't always teach as well or embody are things like community and work as practice. It's kind of a huge emphasis in the Ajahn Chah lineage, in particular in the Thai forest tradition. There's I guess it shows up in both communities, the kind of bias that the real practice, right, is sitting silently in meditation or doing walking. I think that overlooks the importance of integration and engaging with the whole of our humanity and really honoring the complexity of the psyche. So this is another piece from the monastic world that I see as having relevance and a contribution to the lay tradition. As far as the other way around, I think the most honest answer is I don't know. I'm not living in the monastic community and don't know what the specifics are of the challenges that you all face. If there were anything like from the outside that I see, it would maybe be two things. One, I think that the lay community, and these are generalizations, of course, every individual and monastery is unique and has its own strengths and limitations. But in general, my time at the monasteries, there seemed to be, again, a bias towards solitude and formal meditation as the real thing and the most important thing, and a devaluing of the relational space, a devaluing of emotions. If there's interpersonal conflict or tension, it's kind of relegated as in something that's interfering with practice rather than part of practice and something that's revealing something to us. And again, I'm generalizing, but that bias seems to be there, whereas in the lay community, I think in part here in the West, because of the huge influence psychology has had on many of the teachers, there's much more of a sense of kind of turning towards and including that sort of interpersonal, emotional, and psychological material in the practice. And then there's this particular complexity, I think, around how the teachings get applied on a structural and a social level. And I know there's a lot of different views around the role of monastics in society, particularly when it comes to politics and social issues, right? I've been very inspired, though, by the teachings of people like Thich Nhat Hanh or Joanna Macy or even Bhikkhu Bodhi, who really make the argument that the framework of the Four Noble Truths needs to be applied on a collective level, and that the suffering we experience in different communities and on larger levels also needs to be understood, transformed, released through Dharma practice, that it opens us to that realm. And so this is an area that I think is a real growing edge and a learning edge for monastics in our day and age. And how do we make sense of and hold the tensions between honoring lineage, tradition, and the values that upholds with the demands and the pressures of change in society. And I know issues around bhikkhuni ordination have been huge within this particular community, but that's just one example of issues around class, wealth, racism, oppression. So how do we understand those through the lens of the Dharma, and what is the place of those issues and those conversations within the monastic community? I know it's something that the lay community is kind of actively grappling and stumbling through, and making lots of mistakes and doing our best with. And so that's a piece there, I think, where the two communities have something to share and to learn from each other. Yeah. How does that sit with you?
That was an astoundingly good answer to quite a huge, hard question. So thank you so much for that. Ajahn Kovilo.
Yeah, for me it reminds me of this Dhammapada quote, verse 302, that difficult is life of the monastic, and difficult it is to delight in that form, but also difficult and sorrowful is the household life. Suffering comes from samsara, so therefore don't be an aimless wanderer in samsara, pursuing suffering. Yeah, I felt you gave a really nuanced and great answer to that question, and it's always good for us to look at our blind spots, and it's certainly the case, living in a monastery that it's almost custom designed to be siloed, to be this kind of echo chamber, and hearing from people outside of that chamber is very important. And I also just to advocate for monasteries, which certainly you were doing as well. It's nice also to have these bubbles of people who are somewhat outside of the culture to give some kind of perspective to the greater culture. This reminds me of a really interesting quote from your book. It was in the mindfulness section, and I just want to hear maybe how you thread some of these difficult needles. So the quote is, popular mindfulness, and I would suggest that it's not just popular mindfulness culture, but actually some of the oldest texts as well. So popular mindfulness suggests that the sole source of our suffering is individual and internal, ignoring the vast influence of structural factors such as racism, sexism, and poverty on our well-being and our ability to access inner resources. So how does one balance that with, say, quotes from the suttas, which say something like, I am the owner of my karma, heir to my karma, born of my karma, whatever I do for good or for ill, of that I'll be the heir, really suggesting the primacy of that first person internal, I'm the owner of my own karma and actions, versus seeing a broader perspective. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
What a beautiful question. Thank you. Yeah, there's so much to learn. And, I approach this question with a certain quality of humility and inquiry in myself. I think it's one of those questions that, for me, it's valuable to stay curious about and to hold in my awareness, rather than to try to come to a fixed idea about or have a view about, and to recognize the complexity and mysteriousness of these different forces. What is a self? Who am I, and how is that really complex experience of subjectivity that we each inhabit influenced by the larger forces and structures of our society? And are those really separate? How can we separate them? How do we separate them? The Buddha talked about karma on a collective level, right? There's some acknowledgement that there can be, I believe so, can't point to the specific sutta reference, but I've heard teachings about, some sense of collective karma. Open to being wrong there if it's one of those things that gets misquoted. So I think there's something to be said for the handful of leaves, right? Like the Buddha's saying, this is what you need to know to free yourself. My understanding is the Buddha wasn't trying to solve oppression. He wasn't trying to restructure ancient Indian society as an egalitarian liberal democracy. Like, that wasn't his aim. He was interested in helping people to understand their true nature and stop suffering in the way that we are able individually to do that. And so, that's what the teachings are pointing towards, as I understand them. And so the teaching on karma that you quoted there, it's pointing to what are the intentional actions of body, speech, and mind that I'm responsible for, that shape my experience and that lead to more suffering or the ending of suffering from moment to moment. My sense is that the more we understand that and the more we're able to transform those patterns of greed, hatred, and delusion, of reactivity on an individual level, the more we're able to be an agent for change and transformation in some of those larger structural or collective levels. And that being said, that the process of unhooking and understanding our own suffering includes looking at and examining how are the experiences I'm having conditioned by those larger social forces, and how do I disentangle awareness from them? What is that process? Yeah, there's probably more to be said there, but just curious what your thoughts are on it, or how does that sit with you?
No, that sounds just about right. And the phrasing that the Buddha wasn't trying to restructure ancient Indian society to be an egalitarian democracy sounds about right. That is correct. But I think, realizing what we can find in the handful and what other leaves we have around us which are still relevant for our lives is navigation, which is essential. And one thing that comes up from that is this tension between the timeless and that internal working of mindfulness, and then the external world, which in some ways perhaps was externally embodied in your time at a monastery, and then your time, I know that this is actually the essence of my question, is with so many practitioners in our community, they have tasted the Dhamma and really intuited its power and value and want desperately to bring their lives in alignment with it, such that they feel whole. They feel like their external world is aligned with their deepest values as well. Like there's not this constant tension between this internal orientation towards practice and their job and parenting and relationship. And yet so many of them find that very hard to keep. In your book, there's another quote, no longer pulled in 1,000 different directions, we are freed from the agitation endemic to modern life. And then this collected mind is rare and radical. It relinquishes multitasking, increases our attention span, and heals our fragmentation, and scattered concentration reclaims our innate holiness and magnifies the power of the heart-mind. And just in terms of how to bring someone's life into alignment with the Dhamma, how have you managed to do that yourself? And obviously, we speak about making relationship and parenting practice, but what kind of advice do you have for someone who just finds that they want desperately to do that, and the burdens and anxieties and duties of modern life don't seem to totally allow that tension to dissipate?
Yeah, how have I been able to do that? That's a valid question. Yeah, the quote you're reading there is from I think the chapter on concentration, right? And talking about the value of a collected mind and how rare it is. I'm brought back to the passage from the Dhammapada that you just read, Ajahn Kovilo. Difficult indeed is the householder life, and it's very real. It's very real. The challenges, and it's one of the things that I valued so much about living in protected Dhamma environments, whether it's the monastery or living at a meditation center like the Insight Meditation Society, is having the structural supports of a schedule, a community, Buddha rupas everywhere, at the monastery, bowing every time you walk into and out of a room, and just these kind of reminders that stop us and bring us back to the path and the practice. And it's like almost everything in popular society is pointing in the other direction, right? Which is why the Buddha characterized his teachings as going against the stream, against the currents of accumulation and craving and becoming. So I think the first, where I'm getting to here, is that I think the first step is to acknowledge the reality of the challenge and the immensity of the task for lay people who are deeply committed to the path. That it's not easy, and it is going against so much. And for me, that just creates a lot more space and compassion and forgiveness for the difficulty, rather than somehow making it about our shortcomings or, not being whatever enough. Not having enough motivation or commitment or aspiration or faith or diligence, fill in the blank of how you want to criticize yourself, but to be radically honest about the strength of the forces we're up against. Everything from, and you kind of went through the list, but everything from the technology, media, and the sheer economic pressure of trying to keep a roof over your head and have food on the table and health insurance, particularly in a country like the United States where there's such a little social safety net. They're very, very real pressures. And that experience of pressure, I think, lives in the nervous system. It's not just like an idea. The sense of not being at ease or being fragmented is like the air many of us breathe in society. So you can't address an issue until you have some understanding and respect for it. It's like working with the hindrances. It requires a lot of understanding, awareness, and respect for their strength. Yeah, so in the same way, understanding the strength of the forces we're up against, I think, is an important first step. And there are things we can do. It's not hopeless. So some of the key things that help me, and that I would recommend to my fellow Dhamma-farers in the lay world, one is to start small. I always talk about whenever I lead retreats, at the end of the retreat, I try to tell people, be realistic. I would rather you sit for 5 minutes every day and do it than say, I'm going to sit for an hour and, never get to it, because who has an hour, right? So to be really realistic and start small, I like to say that it's the consistency, continuity, and quality of our attention that matters rather than the quantity. So 5 minutes of a sincere practice, to me, every day, will have more of an impact and a transformative effect than 1 hour on Saturday. And the rest of the week, you're just running around crazy. So start small, which includes taking it one day at a time. Really just, like my wife asks me sometimes, like, what's your day look like tomorrow? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm just trying to focus on today. Which isn't always such a good thing. Sometimes I miss things in the morning because I don't know what's happening. So I've actually started looking at the calendar the night. Like, okay, what's actually happening tomorrow? But I try to really stay focused on okay, just what am I doing now? Because I can't do the other things. So why worry about them? And just taking care of what's in front of me. So one day at a time, one moment at a time. Don't do it alone. This is really, really huge. I think for all of us on the path, I find the passages where the Buddha talks about the importance of Kalyanamitta so moving. The single most powerful external cause for the arising of right view is being wise companions, right? Like, wow, that's really big. Who am I spending time with? So, and for many, I think on this path, depending on where we live, it can be very challenging to find like-minded people and to develop meaningful relationships and friendships. So this is really important. And if there aren't people locally availing oneself of the tremendous resource of online community today, like places like this, these kind of broadcasts you all are doing, other communities that get together and practice online, is essential. And then maybe the last, so, start small, one day at a time. Don't do it alone. And then the last thing is I think it's really important to be clear about what we're practicing. The path is so broad in some sense. It's one of the things that I learned in my time at the monasteries is the diversity of practices that the Buddha offered and the kind of creativity we can have in training the heart. Everything from chanting to service to ritual to study. And so one of the things I find a lot in the lay Dhamma scene is there's so many different tools that get thrown at people that there's kind of this confusion, a little bit of muddiness about what we're doing. And so people kind of bounce around into a little bit of mindfulness of breathing, and then do some metta, and then kind of open awareness, and then I go back to metta. And that's just in the sitting practice. And then there's a sense of I'm just mindful, I'm just being mindful. But what does that mean, and how am I actually practicing that? So one of the reasons I wrote my book was to try to provide a little bit more of a scaffolding for how do we actually make this stuff real and transform our lives and our communities from the inside out. And one of the ways of doing that, I think, is being really clear about, what am I practicing? What am I focusing on right now? Am I cultivating patience? Is that the parami I'm working with? Am I cultivating mindfulness? And then if so, what does that really mean to me, and how am I practicing it during my day? Rather than just having some vague idea I'm just trying to be mindful all the time, right? When and how and where, what are you being mindful of? Are you being mindful of your body? Are you being mindful of your emotions? Are you being mindful of your intentions? It's just being mindful just becomes this kind of vague general thing rather than a clear practice that we can follow. So that's another way of kind of anchoring ourselves in our lives so we know what we're coming back to, what tools we're really practicing.
That was a very rich response. A lot there. But overarching principle of just being clear about what we're practicing. Yeah, of course, that's really important. And I appreciated your new book. This is Your Heart Was Made for This. And each chapter, what it is basically a gradual cultivation of wholesome qualities. And you go through, I think it's 26 or so specific qualities. And it's great that you highlighted them and spoke about them so explicitly. And just in general, something you mentioned in your response, and both in this recent book and in your response and in your earlier book, Say What You Mean, bring it back to the body. Bring it back to the body. It's so important, and I appreciate that about your books. And yeah, when one looks at the suttas, it's interesting. Bhante Nalio notes that when you go back to the suttas, you find a number of different body discourses within the suttas. And there is this strong encouragement to have mindfulness inside the body. But another discourse is mindfulness of the unbeautiful aspects of the body. And this is something which is so highlighted in monastic communities, especially celibate communities, where sexuality and sensuality is really at the forefront of our practice. And I'm curious, what is the place for practice of asubha in a lay practice? This asubha is literally focusing on contemplating that which is not beautiful about the body. Is there a place for it in lay practice? And if so, how does one do that? Is it important for everyone? What's the scope of that?
Great question. Yeah. So I don't really know in a broad sense. I think if I were further along on the path, I might have a better sense. I can talk about how I've related to it, and how I understand it, and the way I encourage the lay practitioners that I work with and teach. I remember talking with one of my first teachers, Munindraji, about the body, and him saying, he used this analogy that I'm curious, maybe it's from the suttas, I'm not sure. He said, trying to practice and make progress on the path while being attached to your body is like sitting in a rowboat and trying to row while it's still moored to the shore. So I think there's something, clearly the Buddha emphasized it for a reason. He didn't seem like he did things, just on a whim. So if it's there and he's emphasizing it, clearly there's an important purpose to it in our practice. And if we're aiming for liberation, then it seems essential to understand what is the role of this, which is why I appreciate the question. At the same time, I think we have these different contexts, right? And living a celibate life is a very different context than being in a partnership where sexuality is part of that relationship. And not everyone who's a lay person is in partnership. Not everyone who's in partnership is engaging sexually, depending on their values and their choices around that. So I think that the way the practice gets used will vary depending on our context and our goals. And I say that because, when you're connecting with your partner, it's not the time to be practicing asubha. If you're in a lay context, it's, that will not serve the purpose of that connection, that relationship. But that doesn't mean I think we need to throw the practice out. So for me, I understand the practice in two ways. two or three. One is to examine and transform our relationship with lust and perception. Right? It's looking at the perception of the beautiful, which is something the mind creates in the external world. And so it's a study, to me, it's a study in perception. How does the mind create the object as something that's beautiful or undesirable, or that's repugnant and undesirable, right? And there's that beautiful sutta where the Buddha kind of talks about being able to see the beautiful in that which is unbeautiful, and the unbeautiful in that which is beautiful. Is this incredible sort of flexibility of the mind when we've trained it to be able to use perception skillfully. So, and all of us can do that. And we can do it with a body. We can do it with, an object like a phone or a computer or a piece of chocolate cake, and the way the mind constructs perception, and then craving arises from the contact and the perception that's there. So the Asubha practice, to me, is first an invitation into understanding and witnessing the unfolding of that process in consciousness, which then gives us a way of working with and understanding lust, sensually, and more broadly speaking, kama tanha, sense desire and craving. So I think that lay practitioners can work with Asubha both directly. You're out on the street, you see another body that's attractive, and you study how the mind creates the attractiveness. You take it apart, you look at the unattractive parts, you take the body apart, and learn how to work with that function of perception and its relationship with lust. One can also use it, the practice I learned from Ajahn Sucitto of the patikulas, right? How you turn the perception of something around. So you see something as new, attractive, and beautiful, and you look at the other side of it. You see, in 2 years, it's going to be all beat up and old, or it's going to be the older model, and do I really want it? So to me, it's the same principle of the Asubha practice, but just applied in a different way. So this is one way I think that lay practitioners can use the practice. Another purpose of the practice, as I've explored it and understood it, and it's not a practice that I've done deeply, but it's one that I have a little bit of familiarity with, is understanding. It's a practice of insight into anatta, right? Of understanding the constructed nature of the self through the lens of the body. The body is just this composition of parts, of all these different parts that are actually, quite repulsive when you look at them individually from that perspective. And so I think there's a very kind of deep invitation to those of us who have the aspiration of awakening, who are living a lay life, to examine our relationship with our body, and to really investigate, what is this body, whether it's just the, head of the hair of the body, skin, teeth, nails, is just a kind of deconstruction of the external part of the body, looking more deeply at the form, and am I my body? The reflection on the sense of identification with the body. And I understand one of the ways the Asubha practice works is that through the cultivation of the perception of the unbeautifulness, that helps to break the attachment, because why would I want to be this unbeautiful thing? It's like, when I see the body as, like this wonderful, attractive, vital thing, it's like, I am this body. It's, this is me, versus it's like, my back hurts and my skin's kind of dry and my nails keep growing and I smell after a few days and I have to keep cutting my hair. It's like, is this me? Right? So I just find it incredibly fascinating, and it's just like this adventure into exploring human existence and consciousness, and like what am I? And it's this invitation to look at oneself in a different way. And there's the you know, my experience from the times when I was practicing Asubha more, just practicing it more, it does reduce lust, and it does shift our orientation to physical intimacy. And so I think there's one of the things I talk about with a lot of the lay practitioners I work with is the deeper we go into the practice and the further along we travel on the path, the more our life changes. And, you know, certain activities fall away, and, you know, the first ones to go are usually the kind of more gross violations of sila and things, you know, intoxicants causing harm and things like that. It's like, I don't want to do that. It just doesn't feel good. Friendships fall away that no longer align with our values. And so, you know, I think that there is that potential as we go deeper into the path and really look at the nature of the body and the nature of lust, that our relationship to sex and sexuality changes, not because there's a moral judgment that there's something wrong with pleasure or physical connection, but the internal experience and relationship of it starts to shift such that our priorities and our desires are different. And then that's coming from a very different place than some sense of moral or ethical judgment, like there's something wrong with this or I shouldn't be doing it, which is, I don't think, the point and is not helpful. So it was a long-winded response, but...
Thank you. That was, no, I mean, we're coming at you with some difficult ones, and that was a great answer. I've been caught between two questions I want to ask, so let me put them both out and see which one you feel most interested in.
Yeah.
One is, speaking of these teachings like body contemplation, which are core in a monastic environment, but perhaps more difficult to bring to a Western environment, I'm curious about how you've worked with and what place you see for the teachings on rebirth. And second, I would love to hear any stories, inspiring ones you have about the teachers which you've had faith in, such as Munindraji or others. So I don't know if either one of those sort of jumps out at you, but you could even do both if you really wanted. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably have a sense just from our conversation. I take a very pragmatic approach to a lot of the teachings, and just looking at, like, well, what works, right? Like, what's the purpose of this, and does it free the heart from ignorance and attachment? And, you know, I think the teachings on rebirth, that's kind of how I hold them, in the sense that, like, I don't know. I don't have siddhis. I can't see past lives, so I don't have any, you know, knowledge to prove or disprove it. I take a sort of like, maybe, I don't know, approach to it. But I look at, you know, what's the utility of it? How do we use it in our practice? And I find that the momentary interpretation of rebirth is often very helpful for people. You know, how many lives do we live in a day? How many lifetimes do we live in one lifetime? Like, how many people have I been? How many, you know, even in one moment of time, it's like, you know, am I husband? Am I father? Am I son? Am I brother? Am I, you know, instructor? Am I facilitator? Am I citizen? Am I who? You know, all of these different lives and these different roles that we have. So I think there are many ways to understand it. And to the degree that it supports a sense of faith, energy, aspiration, taking that orientation or that cosmology of multiple lives, great. And to the degree that it confuses us or leads to doubt and vacillation, then I think it's helpful to just set it aside. Yeah. And, you know, in relation to the teachings on karma, I don't think one needs to believe in rebirth or further birth to see the law of karma in effect. very directly in our own lives. And for me, that's always been enough to validate the teachings and recognize it's talking about a real phenomenon that I can experience and witness with my own mind and body. I'll say a few words about Godwin Samaratne, who is less well known in some circles than Munindraji. There's a whole book about Munindraji, which is quite good, that Mirka Nastar wrote, called Living This Life Fully, that I highly recommend for anyone who wants to learn more about him. But I only spent 3 weeks with Godwin, those first 3 weeks of the study abroad program I did when I was 19. And I always had wanted to spend more time with him. And he died before I could. Even though he was younger than Munindraji, he died. He got sick and sort of very, very quickly went downhill and passed away. There was a gentleness and lightness about him that was kind of infectious. This kind of almost childlike joy and curiosity about being human and being alive that one just could kind of be uplifted by just by listening to him talk and tell stories and joke and laugh. He had a wonderful sense of humor. I feel like there's this imprint in my being from having spent time with him. And there's audio recordings of his teachings kind of out there on the internet that I highly recommend for people who aren't familiar with his teaching. But, I think we learn from our teachers not just intellectually or practically, but that there's a transmission of their being and whatever you want to call it, maybe their state of awakening or their parami, that kind of, if we're open, it leaves this kind of indelible impression on our hearts and kind of remember and draw strength from that felt memory. And so one of the things he always used to say that has stayed with me, a few things he would say, he said, learn to be your own best friend. And this was something that he really embodied and modeled in his lightness and sense of humor. And he said, sometimes when I don't feel so good, I like to say to myself in a very gentle way, it's okay to not be okay. And just the tenderness and the warmth and the lightness of that kind of unconditional embrace of oneself, just wherever you are, was a real gift that he gave me.
Yeah, thank you, Oren. I have not met him myself, but I believe that Bhikkhu Bodhi as well took him as one of his, at least influences, and says he was basically living the bodhisattva ideal. So, sounds like a really beautiful person. On this theme of finding inspiration in someone, having faith in a teacher, I was moved and impressed with your reframing or perhaps retranslation of saddha, which is traditionally translated as faith. You do use the word faith in the book, but in the first part of your book, where you talk about the 5 powers, you frame that first factor as being aspiration. And I'm curious if you could speak more about how aspiration or faith work along the path. And I just want to read a quick quote from that same section about doubt. So you say that doubt, which can be seen as like the opposite of faith, doubt agitates us, squanders our energy, and can stop us from pursuing our aspirations. Spinning and waffling endlessly, it distorts our vision. In contrast, healthy skepticism examines data in a careful way without agitation, spin, or distortion thereby bringing us into deeper relationship with reality. So, beautiful quote, and I think a lot of Westerners, which I feel like your book does a great job of speaking to people who are perhaps wary of religion and religiosity, and because of that, often are skeptical of faith. So, yeah, if you could speak a bit more to this play.
Sure. Yeah. 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 It's Saddha is the leader, right? It's the first of the indriyas. I borrow that translation aspiration from Ajahn Sucitto. I think it's one of the ways he translates Saddha as aspiration, and I think Nisabho Bhikkhu often translates it as conviction, right? So what I love about the different translations is it starts to give me a sense of the richness and the nuance of one of these Pali words and kind of all of the different ways it can manifest and that we can understand it. So Sharon Salzberg, who translates it as faith and has a beautiful book by the same title, Faith, talks about it as trusting your own deepest experience. And I love that because it's so accessible. It's like, what is it that we know to be true in the deepest way? So this is one aspect of it. And I talk about this as the receptive aspect of saddha, of aspiration. It's that sense of allowing ourselves to be held, of allowing ourselves to trust, and where can we rest our heart? And it's so essential, I think, just as humans, and just the burden of suffering, the dukkha, that which is heavy. It's hard to be here. It's hard to be here in so many ways, and that sense of being able to have refuge, and this connection between saddha and refuge is so intimate for me. That it's this place that we can feel like we can let down and feel protected and held and safe. So this is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, and the reason I chose aspiration as the translation and the title of that chapter, is what I talk about as a more active aspect of it, which I connect with vision, which is more that sense of conviction that Tanjef talks about, of like, where are we aiming? What's our sense of what's possible? And I think my understanding of the reason it's there at the beginning of the indriyas and why it's so fundamental is, unless we have some sense of there being something possible for us, something better, something good, something fulfilling, we just sink. There's no energy, there's no motivation, there's no orientation. So there needs to be some experience on some level, whether it's intellectually, emotionally, physically, in the heart, through intuition, some concept that there is a better, a brighter, a richer, more meaningful, beautiful, fulfilling potential in life for us to turn towards the path and make effort. And this is why it's there at the very beginning of the book, and why I see it as so fundamental and so important. And maybe this can kind of bring us back to one of the questions you asked earlier about the connection between individual suffering and karma, and the structural forces in our society that create conditions of suffering for so many. This factor of aspiration can function on a collective level too, and I think it's why it's so powerful and important to have a vision of what our communities or society can be like. And when we look at history, we see how the articulation of an aspiration can be a force for change and good in the world. And some of the examples I use in the chapter of, like, the Declaration of Independence, which has sparked revolutions around the world, and which is still, in spite of the complexity of the history and the founding fathers of this country, is still held up as a document that articulates a vision for a society where all have dignity and equity and access to our rights as human beings. Or Dr. King's, I Have a Dream speech, like, why is it so powerful? Is he's articulating this vision of what's possible that then gives us something to orient towards and constellate around and move towards. So I think it's very powerful energy and capacity in the human psyche, and makes sense that the Buddha would give it such a prominent place.
Thank you. I think we've kept you for quite a while, but I did want to just finish with one closing question based on that vision of aspiration, and that's if you had to articulate a prayer or an aspiration for this book going into the world, what would it be?
Yeah. May it give all of us the strength and the courage to act in ways that create a better future for all life on the planet, and may it embolden and empower those who don't have a voice to rise up and be heard, and lead the way towards a different future.
Oren, thank you so much. Beautiful prayer, and from what I've read of the book so far, it looks really wonderful. Myself and Ajahn Nisabho and our board up at Clear Mountain, we did a deep dive into Say What You Mean. I know there's friends at monasteries, monastics, novices, and monks who are using your book as a textbook to learn how to speak more skillfully to others. I've got friends, from before I became a monk who had nothing to do with Buddhism and who've also picked up your teachings and your books and really found a lot of value in them. So you're a really powerful voice, and Ajahn Nisabho and I both really hope we can stay in touch, and wish you the best. So thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. I look forward to staying in touch.